Welcome to the monthly Truck Stop webinar brought to you by the Motor Carriers Insurance Education Foundation. These truck stops are presented the second Thursday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. These webinars are open to members of the MCIEF Foundation. These webinars are presented as industry update for information purposes only and do not qualify for state CE credit. However, the foundation does have a number of programs that do qualify. So if you're seeking CE credit, please refer to our website or call our office or email our office, and Beth will take care of your CE requirements. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window. They will be answered as time allows or responded to after the webinar via email. If you're experiencing any audio problems, please send us a note in the chat window at 800-741-4084, and we'll attempt to correct the problems as soon as possible. Now to the webinar. When I was at the annual conference, a lot of the speakers were talking about some facts, and I think it was dealing with how many people had cameras in their vehicles, things like this. And this gentleman came up to me and said 29%. I said, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm Chris Carver," and we have all that data there. So once the conference is over and Chris and his company actually joined the foundation, I reached out to him and said, "I love data, Chris, and I love benchmarking and stuff. So let me know what you do have there, and would you spend an hour with us and share this information with the rest of retail agents?" So to start off, tell us a little about yourself and where you are in SpeedGauge and what developed it and where you are today.
Well, thank you first, Tommy, for the opportunity. I really appreciate the chance to be here and share with you what's been a 30-year passion for me around gathering this data and putting it together. I'll confess I'm not exactly new to telematics. I built my first telematics device about 30 years ago. In about 20 years ago, we started looking at telematics data and looking at road risk and how we could make our drivers safer by helping them better understand where the risky roads were changing in front of them. And that evolved into a series of businesses, which led to an opportunity about 10 years ago at a major P&C carrier where I led their telematics program. As you and I were chatting about in Orlando, it's a huge amount of data, and it turned out to be almost too much for one insurance carrier to try to contain themselves. So as luck would have it, about 10 years ago, we began talks with SpeedGauge, who had been collecting and has been collecting and been the reference standard for trucking for the last decade, and combining the data from the ELDs, from the cameras, from the road risks measurements that we were making into a single data set has led to where we are here today with Gauge by Fleet. So once again, a lot of data, a lot of time has gone by, but out of that, I hope I can share a lot of insights to your audience today. So once again, thank you.
Yes, I have this starting you. That's 20 years ago. I just came back from homecoming at Wake Forest, and I was there when they got their first computer ever. The IBM 1620 was bigger than any room by the dumpster. So that was my major. So we did that many years ago, and it's gone far beyond what I have capabilities today. But you know, the question of data and data at all, Chris, is you know, what do you do with it? This is an important part of it. And I think right this minute, and I'd like your comment on this before we get started, we almost have an overload with this. And the question is, what are we going to do with it all? Here, on Mark Willison's talk radio show Monday, we had somebody from the who does inspection, CBIS, the Commercial Motor Vehicle Inspection, the head guy there. And he's saying that the crashes have not lessened, and so they're actually looking at how they can be more effective to reduce crashes correlating to these roadside inspections. What can we find out? Do this. In fact, what he did talk about that I thought was interesting is they're talking about telematics also. how can they use telematics more to gain more information out of the roadside inspections to reduce crashes. And so
Right.
this is not something not only you do, insurance companies do, but even the government's doing. And some of the funding in the new infrastructure bill even has some dollars there to try to come up with this kind of stuff. But I just thought it was interesting that all this came together as I was listening to Mark's show Monday on that part of it, listening to the head of the person in charge of that program. It's all come back full circle. Let's look at what we got a little bit here. You provided some slides. So tell me about the slide that we have up here where you say understanding risk right now.
The whole purpose of all of the things you just talked about, Tommy, is really, and we're going to say this over and over, everyone is overwhelmed with data, and it's very difficult with so much data hitting us to understand who's good and who's lucky. We have a lot of tools that we look at every day, but most of those tools have been are tools that look in a retrospective way at how the fleet has performed in the past. With the hiring challenges we have today, the lack of qualified drivers, frankly, new types of loads and new routes, we need to stop looking strictly in the rearview mirror and look out the windscreen and say, what's in front of us? What's this fleet doing right now? And how can we use these volumes of data to make great choices as businesses, but also at the same time, be transparent with the underwriters. It's not just the government. It's going to be understanding the risk right now is going to be the responsibility of all the parties.
Chris, that's the same thing that we talked about at the annual conference, and I preached a couple other things, is that the insurance industry in the past has been reactive. They looked at MVRs, they looked at loss records, they looked at even CSA scores. But those are things that happened in the past. Today, with all this new data, the thing that you're talking about is to be more proactive, which is the same terminology you have, to go forward here and look at the ongoing operations and how can we correct those during the policy term for the state of insurance plan, or during for the motor carrier to do it when it happens and takes action now. So this is why I think we've got to start thinking about the data in that area proactively. Now, there's going to be a pushback in a lot of cases, mainly by drivers. We understand that part, but I think we'll get over that in the future. But we need to also know, and this is why your comments in your conference are important to me. We need to know what is the norm. What is good and bad. And the same question the enforcement officers were talking about on Monday. They're trying to determine what are good and bad. What are the things that are causing the problems, and how can we address just those things instead of some things that they look at that really don't cause problems.
Right. So let's go to the next slide, Tommy. To your point, it's perfect comment. It's really about the drivers. We have to help the drivers gain confidence in the context of the information that we're looking at together. What we need to understand is the context around the telematics data, the ELD data. It's quite different to be speeding 5 miles an hour over across Montana versus 5 miles an hour over in downtown LA. And cameras too provide us lots and lots of data, but without the context, we don't necessarily know that harsh braking event that was just recorded on that truck, we can't see, we don't have enough other surrounding information to be able to treat these drivers fairly. The theme that I'm going to keep coming back to as we talk about your term benchmarking, which is really the right term, is how do we build enough context around each one of these incidents so we understand that driver is doing his or her professional best, and we're evaluating them from an underwriting point of view based on that current real-time view, and we can truly, as we said earlier, understand who's good in that group. So it's the ability to benchmark is dependent on our ability to provide context around each one of our drivers and not compare them against the lighter vehicles that are around them on the road. And we'll talk more about how that impacts their choices. But I want to compare two drivers against similar weight vehicles on the same road at the same time of day so that the drivers understand that benchmarking is about keeping them safe. And this, giving them this feedback is absolutely essential.
I assume since you've been doing this for 20 years, you said, and 10 years and this kind of stuff, have a lot of data. Man, since ELDs were required, what, 3 years ago, December 19th, I guess we're coming up to our 4th year, the ELD
Right.
became mandated, then the ABRs were replaced that 2 years later. And the ELDs now, for you who have listened to our previous programs, ELDs track hours of service, but they track a lot of other things too, because they have to tie into the electronic control module, the ECMs in the engines, and those show a lot of things too. So you combine the geo or the location with the engine activities, you then have not the operation. So you got probably increased ability to have more points to look at than ever before since this mandate, right, Chris?
Absolutely right. I think that we have, we've had an interesting opportunity also in the rearview mirror now, we hope, this pandemic to actually validate the fact that this ELD data by itself can be useful, but we also have had an opportunity to put it together with the contextual information. And if we go to the next slide, I'd love to just kind of walk the
Sure,
audience.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that next thing. Let's talk about how this works. Go ahead.
Let's talk about how that ELD data has come together to help us understand the benchmarks and the baselines. So I'm just going to take a minute and talk you through. We collect data. We work with all the major telematics brands and cameras and ELDs that are out there. We cover about 90% of the installed devices. So this data is an aggregation of millions of vehicles, commercial vehicles on commercial auto policies. This orange line that you see there on speeding is the one that ought to catch everybody's eye. The fact that speed went up, speed has come back down.
Because it's kind of hard to see today. The speed went up during the pandemic, correct?
Yeah, sorry. So that's right.
I'm looking at this, trying to look at this, but this is somewhere around March of 2019 or 2020.
Right. Exactly. The roads were empty. You can see the blue line is the congestion. The congestion went down. Speeding went up. Unfortunately, speeding is still up. We know that has also had an impact on the number of fatalities on the road. They're up almost 7% over 2019 baselines. So the blue lines and the orange lines are very predictive of crash severity. That's basic physics. We all understand that. If two objects hit each other at a higher rate of speed, we're going to have greater severity. The other dotted yellow line in here is an interesting one, which is the highway miles versus local miles. And that actually turns out to be inversely proportional to frequency. So the orange line, speed and distraction, have certainly have contributions to severity, but the mix of highway versus local miles has had an interesting statistical correlation with frequency. And you're probably all wondering, if you look at that little dip there in February. Tommy, do you remember what happened in Texas in February?
Yeah, that's the ice storm that had all the electricity down.
That's right. And so that marched its way throughout that week. It marched its way up the East Coast. We saw impacts on driving. You can see a lot of our truckers understood it, and they routed off those highways and went on more local routes, but still congestion spiked during those times. And then we can also see, obviously, that total miles driven by commercial vehicles at that point were down a little bit. So that's the gray line, and that's the average annual miles. So in general, our total miles are back up to where they were and maybe a little bit above where they were in 2019. But the unfortunate news is there are two pieces of news in this picture. One is congestion is actually up. You might say, but private passenger vehicles are down. Really what's happened is the commute intervals around the major cities have become compressed. So congestion is an absolute metric, is about how many vehicles have we packed in per lane mile, and we'll talk more about this later, but that's actually up in certain areas. And so when we talk about evaluating and benchmarking the risks that our drivers are now exposed to, we need to understand that. And we also need to be paying lots of attention to the overall speed. Are we making good choices around the speeds we select on the roads that we're on and the time of day? So very, very interesting opportunity. It helps us validate many of the assumptions we've made over the last decade. I wish I could take credit for arranging a worldwide opportunity to remove the non-essential traffic from the road, but it taught us an awful lot.
This, Chris, let me ask you a question. I think I've heard you say this. There's more frequency on the off the interstate highway, but not more severity. Is that what you were saying? What I'm saying,
right. So as the traffic increases on the interstate, let me just repeat it back. More of the traffic moves to the interstates and moves to the highways, frequency drops, but severity increases. And as the traffic moves off of the interstates and uses more of the local roads, we all know this traditionally, we've just, urban versus rural miles, zone rating, traditional underwriting methods. We sort of inherently understood this, but this is to your point. Now we're looking out the window, real time, snowstorm comes to Texas, we understand what to expect, okay? So frequency did go up quite a bit during that weather event, but we also know that overall severity probably wasn't as bad in most of the country as what we might have otherwise expected.
I was just going back to the CSA scores where the penalty is for speeding is off the interstate highways, not on the interstate highways, as far as they get called that, because you've got a greater chance of a crash that way part, even though severity might not be there. So that was a point. I think actually did a study about that too. And this graph shows that kind of an example here. The scary part about this, though, on this graph that you have here to me, Chris, is speeding still up. Speeding is, look at this number, is 10 or 15% more frequent than it was in 2019. Yet with all the emphasis now of speed limiters and all on vehicles, and now with the fuel costs going up and the fuel getting back to fuel consumption as a factor of speed, that kind of bothers me a little bit.
Well, it's a really good point that you make, Tommy, because it takes us back to our opening slide, our opening talk about the context. When we talk about speeding, again, 5 miles an hour over going across Montana is very different from 5 miles an hour over going through an urban area. We have to really help in order to have our drivers appreciate what we're doing to make them safer. Is we have to be able to take into account what is the correct speed for that particular road based on the weight of the vehicle they're driving. Not what some road engineer said, but what they as professionals know is the right choice. And what are other trucks that look exactly like them on that same road doing? Are they in the left lane going faster? Or are they in the right lane, following at an appropriate distance?
All right, next slide, next. You ready?
Yes, please. Thanks. So out of this has come, we're looking at over the last 2 years, this is an aggregation of our data and data from lots of our telematics partners. That picture really paints the whole view for everyone in that room. When you asked me the question about how many cameras are there, it was our ability to look across all these different telematics providers where I was able to tell you that, 83% of the heavy and extra heavy trucks out there have some sort of a device that was contributing data to allow us to be able to build using our somewhat limited view, but be able to build a picture of what was really going on out there. These are, petabytes of data. There's far more data here that could ever be analyzed by an underwriter. Let's just put it in perspective. In those in this data that we've analyzed, there's 60 billion miles of driving data. That's, you know, round numbers, that's about 300 trips to the sun and back. So
if you were going that way, yeah.
yeah. So clearly we need a way to simplify it. We need something in the trucking world that's akin to kind of the personal credit scores that we look at. We need a way to bring it down to understand how is this trucking company, this motor carrier operating by comparison to its peers. Okay, what does it really look like? And not in a historic way, but right now. They tell us they're doing better. They've hired they've made some new hires. They're going back to more traditional types of risk services. And, you know, what's that impact look like? And so our next slide really talks about, you know, where is the residual risk and what kind of a score do we need? We need to find out, as I said earlier, who's good and who's lucky. Who's in the upper half of the class? Who's in the green? Who's in that band in between, who's kind of, you know, a reasonable risk, but not perfect, okay? And then who's down here at the other half, you know, in the other half of the class. The first thing I hope everyone in the audience is paying attention to is the fact that this graph, which is unfortunately a little small to read, but there's not nearly as much green. I know we're coming up to Christmas. I wish there were more green than red, but there's not nearly as much green as there is red. Okay, so we have changed the mix of traffic. We have changed the times of peak congestion and different times of day. We still have the late afternoon effects of frequency of incidents that happen then, but the new normal doesn't look anything like it did in 2017 and 18. So the idea of a benchmark, a score, if you will, like a credit score, we call it the FAIR score, is to figure out how do I benchmark which one of these four quartiles above 660 is my operation in. And I can do that for an organization. I can do that for a business. I can also do that at the individual driver level. It takes about 500 miles of driving to be able to benchmark an individual driver. You hear often from the television ads for personal lines, you know, drive around for a week with our gadget and we'll be able to tell you whether you're a good driver or not. That's not appropriate for a motor carrier, for a professional driver. We need a significant chunk of data, at least 500 miles of data, preferably more, to really understand their behaviors. Because a driver who might have been a great driver a few years ago who's come back may have picked up some bad habits, may have gone back to some bad habits. And if we know where the red roads are, the roads that don't look like they used to when he or she was driving in the past, we now have the ability to help them and point those roads out to them with benchmarks that are designed to help everyone.
So about 500 miles, that's 2 days of driving a truck, basically.
Yeah, in a long haul operation, absolutely.
That part of it. But that's interesting because I always said that there's 3 times in a truck life: the inexperienced driver, the good driver, and then the complacent driver who throws everything at the end part of it. And so I guess in this case, you're going to track all 3 of those things and hopefully it'll get to the middle of the ones paying attention to it versus the old guy who knows how to do it without this part. But this is what you're trying to sort out, right? Or at least
right. We're trying to. Right, so exactly right. What we're trying to understand is that driver's still making great choices given the rest of the context that's around them. Okay. So when we go to the next slide, and I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this to try to understand what we call the 3 C's. So we have the choices that the driver's made, we just spoke about. Is that driver still making good choices? We all have things that go on in our lives, right? And whether it's impacting somebody in dispatch who's picking the routes for that driver, whether it's the drivers themselves, but there are things going on which change our driver behavior. But if we don't understand the capability of the vehicle that the driver's been assigned and that has been assigned to that particular route or that particular load, we don't yet understand whether we're dealing with a safe motor carrier or not. The final piece of this is you have to understand the context of those routes. So if you bear with me, I'd like to just take you through what we've learned. And this is not exactly the simplest part. Hopefully I can explain it in a way that helps everyone. But it's taken us the better part of a decade to sort of figure out how to build these layers in a way that they were actionable for an entire company to develop a safe operation around. Okay, so when a motor carrier is looking at their operations, the first thing they look at is what kind of vehicles are we going to equip our drivers with? What are the capabilities of those vehicles? And as we go forward in time, as we have vehicles that have greater and greater technical capabilities that are used, safety systems that will protect our drivers, what driver do I want to assign to that vehicle? What percentage of the time was that vehicle operating in a mode where the ADAS system was providing principal operational control for that vehicle? What was the driver? What are the driver's requirements of the drivers when we're in that mode? So that's kind of the base layer. We have to start out by better understanding the capabilities or the kinematics of the vehicles themselves. Once we understand that, the next thing we need to understand is what is the class of business we're talking about. We spoke a few moments ago. I said, obviously today we're talking more about the long haul operation for the motor carrier. But when we get into regional trucking, we get into the more local trucking operations, all of these same principles apply. If I know what kind of a road that I'm expecting to see a certain type of truck on, and I'm not seeing them there, then road usage and which type of road, this is what ultimately we were, when we look at zone rating, this is what we were trying to get at with zone rating, was the idea that different roads were appropriate for different types of operations. By being able to build a score that's mile by mile for all 4 million miles of roads that our motor carriers will find themselves on, we're able to really understand, is that the right road and what is the risk? So then each road segment in layer 2, we then assign their risk zones, which tell us what is the level of risk for that weight truck, for that type of load, and where are the historic incidents and the losses that we would see. Then we get into layer 3, which is the traffic itself, the congestion I spoke about earlier. Are we in LA or are we in Montana? So two variables there in traffic. One are the dynamics of our vehicle. Are we, by comparison to other professionals on the same road in that same weight vehicle, and I'll keep coming back to the basic VIN configuration of that particular VIN, we've got to be better at understanding what is that underlying vehicle. So the dynamics, how am I comparing to other vehicles of the same weight pulling the same load? And then from a congestion point of view, how's the traffic around me behaving, right? I need to behave differently as a driver and as a professional based on the kind of congestion that I'm dealing with.
Chris, let me stop you for a minute here, okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this is very interesting. And an old ex-truck salesperson, which I was, owned a National Harvester dealership for 10 years, understand some of this stuff. Are you talking about even the differences between a Kentworth and a Peterbilt, or one that's new versus one 3 years old? Is that something underwriters need to start thinking about as far as the risk characteristics?
What I'm telling you, Tommy, is that somebody needs to think about it. I think that's more data than our underwriters could possibly, we're about trying to understand the risk better than we did last year. But in this scoring methodology, yes, we are trying to bring it down to a Pete versus a Kenworth. We're trying to bring it down to a Volvo versus a Freightliner, and really understand, is that type of new technology that's been implied. Yes, the salesman made us a lot of promises, to your point, but is it working as well for certain classes of business, for certain age drivers?
But beyond that, Chris, what you bought into, it is simplicity part of it. There should be or could be a difference between a truck that's 8 years old, a truck that's 3 years old, and a truck that's new. If you can buy a new one today, which you can't buy a new one today.
You can't get them, right?
Chips out there, but that's beside the point. But that is something underwriters can talk about, because we're always talking about 15 years. or 10 years, and most of that was physical damage, not our liability. But you're bringing an element to this now with all this new technology and autonomous vehicle stuff, that might be something that we need to start thinking about if the facts show out with data later. I mean, we got to go back to the crash instances later, but this is what you're tracking now that will give us some information that might be useful to even sort it out even more deeply than we are today.
Right, and that's, that was to your point earlier, the ability to plug into that ECM, get that additional data. But we can't, from an underwriting point of view, going layer 0 through 4, we can't expect the underwriters to look at every one of the variables that go into this, but we've tried to organize this in a way that's, what's the basic capability of that vehicle? Layer 1, what are the basic roads and the capabilities of roads that we're going to see that vehicle on? Layer 2, where are the risk zones? Where are the hot spots? Where's the emerging risk facing that business? What's the weather that they're dealing with on those type of roads? And then we get into the traffic. And then, as in the pandemic, when it went up and down, how is that impacting their choices and what time they dispatch, and what does that do to the profile of the business? And then finally, of course, we look at the actual road types and the maintenance status of those roads. Up here in Seattle, and having spent some time in my years up north of the border in Calgary and in British Columbia, we all understand that the farther north you go, the more immediate the impact of the maintenance status, but the further south we go, the less we tend to take it into consideration when we look at the overall safety metrics of a motor carrier. So those 5 layers are ultimately what help us understand not only the choices that management is making, but dispatch is making around where and when our vehicles operate, what's outside of the control of the driver is essentially what 0 through 4 are. And then layer 5 brings in the detailed driving data, the choices that our drivers are making. That third, so we've got the capabilities, we've got the context, but now we have to look at the choices that the individual drivers are making. And is that driver making great choices given the route, the load, the vehicle that they were assigned?
So what we're saying is the motor carrier controls a lot between 0 and 1, the equipment they're driving, where they're driving, what time of day they're driving, things like that. Now, with that situation given to that driver, which drivers are using that better or worse than others? It's what you have
exactly
down to, right?
Exactly. And what's interesting to me anyway, and hopefully to everyone on our call, is that the businesses that look at this and look at these benchmarks actually are increasing their driver retention, because now the drivers don't feel like somebody's pointing a finger at them, but instead they're lending a hand by saying, I understand what you're facing. We're going to give you some extra time this week because we understand what's going on, instead of, hey, I've got to have this load here by this time. So the overall operation can be in balance, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But if the underlying foundation of any house isn't solid, and we don't have good data going in there, great choices by the drivers aren't going to save the day.
Right. Next slide, I guess.
Yes. So the way I've just described in getting things in balance is really what the FAIR score is all about. The idea of the score is a combination of, as I just described, the layer 5, the choices that the drivers are making, and then underlying that, the choices that management, if you will, is making and operations are making. In terms of those two together is what creates our overall score for the business. So this is not a score that will track exactly with the telematics score that might come from the telematics system or the camera system, or even the ELD system. Some of those are doing scores now. We tie into 90% of them, and we bring that together. And as I said, we provide additional environmental information so that we can create a better picture of the sources of the exposure which that business is facing, and understand whether the choices the business is making and the choices that the drivers are making are frankly working together to decrease the overall exposure of that business? And how does it benchmark against similar businesses that look like theirs?
So two things about this. What you said, FAIR score. What does FAIR stand for? Just the word FAIR, or it's an acronym?
It's an acronym we came up with because our drivers wanted to know that it was fair, but it's the forward assessment of index risk or insured risk. So it's indexing a business not just against other vehicles in general, but really indexing them against other motor carriers on that same road at that same time of day.
Well, and it also gets back to credit scoring, because the higher the score is, the better the person's taking care of their obligations to make payments. You're saying here, the higher the score is, the better the motor carrier is paying attention to putting the equipment the driver has, and the driver's cooperating and using the equipment to do better, and you're combining the two. So I think there is a correlation between things we've been using for a long time, credit scoring as a measurement of the predictability of a crash. And I guess you assume that if they're doing this stuff right, there's less chance they're going to have a crash. They're going to have crashes, but this might reduce the numbers of them and also maybe the severity of them. Is that the bottom line?
Exactly right. And part of the reason for using that same score is every driver understands credit score. Right. They know if they're in the 700s, they're going to get that loan. They're going to be able to buy that house they're working for. If they're down in the 500s, they're not going to get there. So, there's always confusion in new drivers, especially when you start talking about ISS scores and CSA scores. Am I trying to go up, or what's 100th percentile mean? That doesn't mean you're the best. So the whole idea here is to give them a benchmark that is easily relatable to everyone who's in this conversation, from the driver to the retail agent to the underwriter.
And Chris, the one thing you brought up, and this is the first one I've seen done like this, you put in the first part of the equation is what's the position the motor carrier put the driver in first. Right. Because that's a part of it, meaning equipment, time of day, where they're going, this kind of stuff. So you're pairing that with the driver's actions too. So it's not all on the driver, because in some cases the driver's put in an untenable position by the first element. That's who they're working for. So you try to balance that out. I think that's a cool combination of those two, and not just focusing on the driver did something wrong.
Exactly. And those are the organizations where we see the trends. It's a great point, Tommy. We're seeing trends of continuous improvement, where those organizations who pull those heat maps that we provide and understand where those areas of emerging risk are and plan accordingly. Those are organizations where the drivers feel valued, the drivers stay around, hiring is easier, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great point.
Next slide, I assume.
Yes, please. So the next question always is, does it work? Nice to copy credit scores, but does it work, right? So breaking it down, this blue line, this is a bit of a marketing. Obviously, there's, as you well know, there's a lot of noise in this line. But essentially, from an insurance underwriter's point of view, everybody generally gets what we expect to happen. The better risk, this should be relatively linear in the green zone, where our better risks generally have lower loss costs than our worst risk. But here's the interesting point, is this little arrow up here. I don't know if you can see it at 660. This is the gap. This is the chasm. Once we drop below 660, the number of high severity claims climbs very rapidly, okay? We built this with loss runs and actual all of the claims. So it's ground up losses for some captives as well as some self-insured. So we have guaranteed cost customers as well as loss sensitive customers in this. What's happening here is we're segmenting out the operations, the fleet, but we can also see the drivers over at this end who are difficult to defend when that one thing happens, because we all know, what happens once the other party gets hold of cell phone records and things like that. If we can help our drivers understand that staying up at the right end of the credit score, right end of the fair score. As an organization, we build a culture which drivers want to come to work for, because they understand that the management values them, management understands what they're exposed to, and ultimately management wants them to be in the green, in the upper half of the class.
Now, I want to just emphasize to the audience here who did not hear this and compare some other data out there. Most of the data you're getting from FMCSA, when you talk about how many frequencies and how many frequencies you have per 100,000 miles or 1,000,000 miles and all, have to do with DOT recordable crashes. And so what Chris is bringing here is we got two elements. These are actual claims filed by the insurance company, not just DOT recordable crashes. And you also have a severity factor involved in this part of it, as nobody else has captured that part. Obviously, you're getting the data information from the various different providers. This is more like the personal lines clue scores that people have that can be involved in crashes and stuff that nobody else has done. But you access the and you share this information, I guess, with the other parties who furnish it to you, so that they have this data. That's the quid pro quo, I imagine.
Yes, it is. And at the end of the day, it's in everybody's best interest, because now the drivers understand how to be safe and where their peers are. We can see, this is where a majority of drivers spend their life, is about, right in the 711 to 725 zone. Every one of us, we have a primordial desire to be safe, right? We all, back to, millions of years ago, right? We all joined the same village and slept in the same tent because somebody was on guard. So the idea is to use this data to be our guardrails. The idea is use this data to help us understand what are the outlying behaviors, where are our other professionals who are driving the same weight vehicles on those roads, and how do our drivers stack up? So when we have a new driver who, by everything on paper, or whether this all of their driver history, I'm not saying for a moment not to have good hiring standards and not to have proper training, but was that training effective? And if we can immediately see that driver that we just hired is here in this green band in the middle, we know we've made a good hire. Often we have this situation that underwriters are faced. You've got somebody who comes in who's got a couple of, the driving record has a little hair on it, and but they've been away. Bring it back. We're going to put them through training. We will know immediately, as I said earlier, at least 500 miles later, whether that person belongs on that kind of a route with that motor carrier, or maybe we need to pull them back and do a little more local driving, or we need to, give them some additional training because they're simply out of practice and making poor choices.
And so this next slide just kind of talks about understanding the risk better ever with the easy interpreted transparency metric. This is the fair scoring that you have here, and what we talked about, who's good and what is, or just lucky. I think it's, we always talk about you're lucky, and this is some of the theories you have in hard crashes, and you have in just escapes, and the training that has been with us a long time about avoiding the crash later by showing the driver what they did now that did not cause the crash is as important as addressing the crash itself. And this is real-time monitoring. You did make a comment I want to clear up this part. This driver that we have here, do you actually keep an individual driver score that they can take with them somewhere else?
The driver scores, if they give permission, are portable, okay? But the point that we want to make here is we don't, in this Gauge My Fleet, we don't display driver names, okay? So on this particular VIN, if it's a single operator, obviously there's a one-to-one correlation. But if they're slip seating, there could be many drivers in this operator score. So, there are summary scores. We have our operators of these vehicles, back to our driver's choices. This is how our drivers scored. What choices are they making relative to other professionals? They're on the left, called the vehicle operator score. And on the right is the combination of their score and the load and road risk that they're encountering by comparison to similar operations to their own. So when those two numbers are within about 10 points of each other, you've got an organization that I like to call is in balance. Tommy, I kind of think of it like a teeter-totter, okay? If my operator scores are fantastic, okay, but my overall fare score is low, I'm looking at and I'm underwriting an organization that is depending on their drivers to keep them out of trouble. That's an organization. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I want you to finish. I was just going to point out, you made two things, this information. One thing is that we talk about the VIN here, the VIN number of that truck. That's because ELDs have the VIN number. So we're able to go back to the VIN number here. We use that for other things. And the other thing, slip seating is where you have, and this is happening today a lot at the ports and all, where the truck runs 24/7, and you put 2 or 3 drivers during that 24 hours period of time. So now the individual driver's habit could be different than what the vehicle sells. But most over-the-road, for-hire interstate truck drivers don't do that. There could be some team drivers that you would have to factor in. Those would have some peer pressures to make sure both of them are there, but not, I guess 85%. I'm giving you numbers now, you know better than I do, Chris, but intuitively 85 to 90% would be one driver and one truck for one trip.
Precisely, Tommy. And your audience can't see these little numbers down here, but I just want to take a moment and talk about the individual drivers. You will find if we put the overall fare score, it might initially surprise your audience to say that the vehicle with the best fare score may not have the highest operator score. And that can be because this person is being given a low risk route to drive because they're, what I'll call an intermediate driver. They're somebody who's trying hard, they're doing a good job. But what we find often on experienced fleets is our best driver scores are down here in the middle. The overall fare score is assessing the exposure of the route. So a high safety score on a moderate fare score says we've got a great driver who's handling our riskiest routes. And so this is fantastic for any company and points to the fact that you've got some of your best training opportunities right there within your own company by saying, Tommy's got an 800 or an 840 on his driving. Go talk to one of our, folks at the bottom of the class. Go talk to Tommy. What is he doing? Because he's taking the same truck, the same make and model. What is he doing differently? And so we create some gamification, which we see in this trend at the top. You can't see those numbers, I'm sure, but what you can see, those who could read it, this fleet started at a 680 and has made themselves work their way all the way up to a 712. So this is a group that, where we can see the feedback loop is working. And nobody likes to be at the bottom of the class. And the fact that they can go talk to another driver and find out what he or she is doing in an objective way before they have to go talk to the safety supervisor makes everybody feel more valued. Your best drivers feel like they're helping.
Yeah, I always pointed this out that to show this stuff, and we as a foundation, a lot of our presentations show agents who've been successful by doing the apps right, which show trucking companies successful by being safe. And the comment is they're doing business because it is better business to be safe and fewer crashes. And as you point out, retain the drivers and all by paying all this attention. But the one thing you brought this that I thought was interesting here, because the driver scores don't follow you necessarily. But what you're saying is on a typical over-the-road long-haul operation, that when you put the driver behind the wheel, and that is a new driver, by the time they get that load delivered, in most cases, you'll have enough data to be able to start scoring them and seeing how they're operating. That's revolutionary. That's better than the cameras and stuff that we've had now to add another layer to it, because now you can read it immediately for the motor carriers who bought into this. And that's the important part of it.
Yeah, and just to make sure I heard you correctly, Tom, but this is not to say it's instead of cameras. We're getting our data from the camera.
We're getting the data from the camera. I'm just saying it's an overlay, and you don't have with the camera part of it, because the camera is only tracking the events that set the camera off. where you're tracking everything they're doing, the part of it. So it's more of a, you can get more data quicker and have a quicker evaluation than waiting even for the apps that show just the hard braking and this stuff, because you factor in these other, their speeding and where they're going and all this when there's not an event that becomes an event that some of this, the apps record. That's what I was pointing out.
Absolutely, and you brought to mind a story of a woman that I had the pleasure of speaking with recently. When she really got it. She was driving for a small operator. It's a 4-vehicle, it's an extended family, if you will. And she always loved driving. And then they got a new camera system, and suddenly there were these incidents that people were pointing their finger at. And she said, "I've never hated driving trucks so much in my life. The pleasure is gone." But when we then put that together, not just with the other 3 members of her team, but with this larger picture, and she realized that she was actually in the top quartile of drivers, and that the problem was, from a management point of view, they weren't giving her, and this is typical of many operations right now, they weren't giving her enough time in certain parts of the country to get through there. And so, when we can put this into a picture like this that presents a trend and doesn't feel like we're pointing a finger at an individual driver, but in fact, we're creating an environment that lifts everybody up by lending a hand with reference data that is believable by the drivers, by dispatch, by the retail agent, by the underwriter. That kind of validation has been very, very powerful for pointing out who are the great drivers in our group, or who are the good drivers who are going to soon become great drivers.
Chris, we talked about earlier when we talked here about your product, and so far, and this is not sales, the data is great here. You're saying that the motor carrier can share this, or the insurance provider can get this at no cost to the insurance provider or the retail agent, correct? But the motor carrier has to sign in to be a part of this, because that's how you get the ability to accumulate the data. Is that how it works?
That is exactly right. So the individual motor carrier makes a choice with this is up to their retail agent. The agent broker are going to get this data, going to make the request to say, hey, we've got the renewal coming up. Maybe there's some things on the CSA score where the CSA score is up a little bit, or the ISS. They want to give a better picture to the underwriter. They sign them up for this Gauge by Fleet product. There's no cost to it. They sign up, they share their data. We get the ability to come in and build a benchmark. The way our company works, you'll see a little blue dot here in the middle, Tommy, where this is what we call Safety Center.
Right.
That little advertisement there is basically our coaching service. If they choose and they want to come in and get some coaching because they would like to see their scores higher, for the initial 90 days, we give that to them for free. But then after 90 days, it's kind of like the free gym membership, right? You go, you learn the exercises, you get the trainer to show you how to use the machines, and then you can go home and do them in the garage. They don't need to pay for anything. They can still get this from their retail agent. They can sign them up. They can't get this from their telematics provider. They have to go to the insurance side of the house to get this. And then if they and their agent decide, that their retail agent decide that they need to try to get the score up a little bit higher before their renewal, then they can come to SpeedGauge and get the additional coaching if they so desire. But what we're talking about here for the members of and anyone who's part of the foundation is the ability to use Gauge by Fleet to better understand this risk and better understand the driver and the combination of vehicles and drivers that they're using in a way that previously they just didn't have access to. No 2 drivers are the same. No 2 vehicles are the same. And even mixing them, you're going to get different results. So that's what this tool is all about.
So let me just kind of summarize this, because we're getting to the end of this, Chris.
Okay.
In today's marketplace, what would you say? 95% of motor carriers have enough technology, event recorders or cameras or something in their units that you would be able to have a score for them.
Absolutely. I would say, 95, 97% are going to have something. When we're talking about the motor carriers, the over-the-road motor carriers that
Yeah,
you
the
and I have been
interstate for
speaking about
hire,
here,
which is the core of our foundation.
yeah,
And,
that we're going to have them.
and
We
some of it, more data, the better, but at least there's some there. And the second thing is, if I'm a retail agent, I can approach my insured and say, insured, you got some wrinkles here, you got some things here. We have ability to have you engaged here at no cost to you to find out more data that then I can take to my underwriter to show that you're doing things right, that you've overcome some of this problem. Is that what the pitch is of that area?
Absolutely. So it's a private conversation between that retail agent. They're bringing value to that fleet, showing them something that they can't get from their existing technology provider, helping them better understand their operation. And then those two together, better understanding the total cost of risk, make their decision about, what the conversation that they want to have about risk transfer for the upcoming year. And it's giving them that better picture, that more holistic picture.
So, and the third element is, now if the fleet wants some help coaching and all, the fleet pays for that part of it. And this is what it's like, getting a credit scores, and these companies saying we can help you improve it. You get a credit score free if you want to improve it. You hire this advertisement. But that's a good point to make here, because a lot of people are improving, but there's no positive way to prove that proactively. Only way you can improve it is over time. This allows them to prove it within a very short period of time that they're doing these kind of things. I think that's the hook, or that's the advantage. What you say, Chris?
Absolutely. And then the one point I want to make, Tommy, just is from a SpeedGauge point of view, they don't come to us to buy this. They go back to their existing technology. They already selected that technology, a Keep Truckin' and OmniTrax. They just go into their marketplace at Keep Truckin'. They'll click on SpeedGauge and they'll be able to buy the Safety Center services. So,
okay, so it's already with their tech. It goes through the combination of technology, and then you have the coaching using this other stuff on top of it. Okay, that's
right. So they purchase that through
the agent wouldn't be involved in any of that quote sale. They're just getting involved in the data and collecting the data here and having them buy into it, and then give them the option. Talk to your ELD provider or your technology provider if you want more.
Exactly right, Tommy. Exactly right. So two trusted faces in this relationship for Gauge My Fleet. The agent, the retail agent who's bringing them this opportunity to better understand themselves, and then they go back to their technology provider if they want the additional technical help.
Chris, we're done here. We look forward to a good Christmas season here. Starting a new year, but this is good stuff. Appreciate you spending your time with us today and our members today. And we look forward to a great 2022 for us all. And maybe we'll be together in Phoenix or Orlando or both places and visit some of these people face to face. Chris, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And let me take the opportunity to wish everyone a very happy holiday. So safe travels for everyone who's going to be moving on over the holidays. So thank you again, Tommy, and thanks to everyone on the call.
Thank you.